You're listening to Errol Parker and Clancy Overall, editors of the Betoota Advocate, on Desert Rock FM.
Welcome back to the Betoota Advocate radio show, recording live here in the Diamantina. We send our condolences down south. The majority of the country remains in lockdown. It wasn't a race. It's never been a race. Yeah, I guess it was a race to close borders, and that's about all we've been racing for. But, the show goes on. Queensland, the North rises in the ashes. There's an Olympics coming to Brisbane that no one kind of passed through like a ripple in the ocean. But that's pretty good news. You still go to the pub in all of Queensland. And, Diamantina Shire is all right. We did get rocked by one grey nomad came through with a cough. Errol, editor-at-large of the Betoota Advocate, was exposed to that. So he's a close contact. He's at home. He's not here today. Today with me is a prominent Australian writer, author, memoirist, journalist who's just released a book, and we're going to be talking about that and more. I'd like to welcome to the show the Jacaranda Queen, Bridie Jabour. Thank you for joining us.
What a pleasure to be here in your beautiful part of the world.
Now, I said that right, Jabour. That's the pronunciation of your last name.
You've said it wrong both ways.
Jabour?
It's Jabour.
Jabour.
In Grafton.
In Grafton.
But the original pronunciation, the Lebanese pronunciation, and the one that I use now is Jabour.
Okay.
But I respond to Bridie Jabour all the time when I'm back home.
Yeah. And you probably spent most of your life just thinking that was your name? Or your old man kind of told you that, no, they're saying our name wrong?
No, I knew from a very young age, actually. Everyone in my family, most of them go by Jabour, but my aunt, my dad's one of six, and his younger sister went by Jabour. So we knew that Jabour was the proper pronunciation, but we didn't mind that it was Jabour. My grandfather, who was Lebanese, would say Jabour. Everyone was fine with the fact it had been anglicised when my great-grandparents landed in Australia, and my grandfather kept it anglicised as well. But it was funny how it happened. I was Bridie Jabour for 18 years, and then I left home and went to the Gold Coast, and someone asked me my name, and I said, it's Bridie Jabour, and thought it was, I think, a little bit funny to use the original, or I was just testing it out using the actual pronunciation. But of course it stuck, because you tell someone what your name is, they believe you what your name is. And so I've been Bridie Jabour ever since, and for many, many years now. It was very funny at my wedding, because my wedding was in Grafton, and it was a real collision of my worlds, and there was my whole big extended family plus all my high school mates who knew me as Bridie Jabour. And then, my media colleagues, my Guardian colleagues, everyone that I've ever met since leaving Grafton, all there in one room. And the celebrant was an old friend of my dad's, and he knew Jabour was the proper pronunciation, but Jabour's what we used. And I told him to use Jabour because that's the name I grew up with. Yeah, I'm back home in Grafton. I'm Bridie Jabour. And then he said it, and I could hear the ripple through the congregation, like all these whispers. And afterwards, there were so many people from The Guardian who asked me if they'd been saying my name wrong for years.
She's polite. She didn't let us know. Now, tell me, was there drums at your wedding, or you don't have a Lebanese drumming band on hand in the mid-north coast?
No. We did not have, not only do we not have a Lebanese drumming band on hand, there are not many people, if any people, on that side of my family with much of a musical note.
Okay. All right. So it was no Salim Mahaja wedding.
No, nothing like that. Oh, the size of it maybe. There were a lot of people there. My family's huge, but no other comparisons, no.
So how does we were just speaking before about this virus, and it sounds like you've got a lot of family who are, I guess, health workers. Emergency
frontline workers, nurses. Yeah. My mum is still a full-time nurse. My sister has just become an emergency nurse. My brother is an ICU nurse in Sydney as we speak. He's at work treating COVID patients. He texted me this morning about it.
Did they vaccinate him?
Yeah, he got. But you know what? Felt it was a little bit late. He treated COVID patients on ventilators last year. So he was unvaccinated last year in the first wave. That was obviously pretty stressful for my family. And then when the vaccinations came, they didn't really get to him till April. And I kind of thought, is he not the most front of the frontline workers? Like, why is this kid not vaccinated yet? Even at the beginning, it felt there were signs, I think, that it was a bit slower than it should be.
Yes, I think everyone's kind of feeling that at the moment, maybe.
If it's not a race, but we've definitely lost.
Yeah, if it was a race, we have come last in the OECD. Now, how does from everything you've just described here, kind of multicultural upbringing, Irish mother, Lebanese father, Grafton, predominantly, everyone's heading towards working as nurses or working as frontline workers. How did you pick up a pen? What led you there? What led you to this career now where you've had a couple books published?
Well, it's pretty cliched, but I read a lot as a kid, which I think anyone who is in this industry says. Yeah, I was a big bookworm, so were lots and lots of people. I used to get in trouble actually at like 1 a.m. My dad would be, or before then, Dad would be leaving for night shift and he would find me reading and I would get in trouble. So there was that, but there was also, I think, more than that, there was, I've always loved people. Mm-hmm. Always been hugely curious about people, love talking to them, love stories and I think that has played a bigger part in me becoming a journalist than me being a voracious reader when I was young. But I wasn't on track at all to be a journalist, actually. When I was a teenager in Grafton, that world seemed very, very far away. And that was 2005, 2004. Even then, they were saying the media was in the death throes. Mm-hmm. And so it's 15 years ago.
Well, the death of print, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And also it was just said over and over again, it's really hard to become a journalist. Like we thought it was hard 15 years ago. It is near impossible now. But so I just thought, it's too difficult. I don't have the connections really. Like I didn't know how to do it. And then when a few months before I finished school, when I was 18, I went to pick my siblings up. I was on break between, I think, trial HSC and real HSC. And the principal had left forms on the desk with the office ladies for a scholarship to Bond University. And it was a journalism scholarship that came with a cadetship at the Gold Coast Bulletin. Mm-hmm. And the office lady said, Mr. Crooks, I still remember him. He changed my life in that way. Has left this out for you. So I thought, I'll apply. And I was applying for everything. I also got shortlisted for an economics scholarship at the University of Sydney. So my life could have been completely different. But I got this scholarship and it was the only journalism thing I applied for. I didn't apply for that degree in any other way. And it was because it came with the job, the cadetship, and it was earning money, which was awesome. And went through the interview process. It was apparently pretty competitive and got it. And then that was it for me.
I've only ever heard of 2 people ever on scholarship at Bond University. One of them is a good friend of yours in the shape of Rick Morton.
Yes.
Did you? And also, he said he opted for Bond as well as a budding writer because of that cadetship with the Gold Coast Bulletin.
There's no way either of us would have gone to Bond without that scholarship cadetship. Yeah,
right. So it was a bit different for you because actually that's an ideal kind of university to attend, Grafton to the Goldie. You can you're not too far from home.
Oh, it was still back. It's way closer now because the highway's finally been upgraded, but that was still in the heady days of Premier Bob Carr not upgrading any infrastructure for a decade.
Yeah.
So it was 3 hours, I think. Mm-hmm. Might as well have been 15 hours.
It was back when, it's a bit further north, but back in the days when that highway used to go through, towns like Woolgoolga. You used to like everything's been bypassed now.
That bypass is super recent. So it went through Ballina. It doesn't go through Ballina anymore. Yeah, it went through Woolgoolga.
The Kempsey Bridge.
It doesn't. Yeah,
that was a great little car park on the way up the coast and down the coast.
And it doesn't even go through Grafton anymore.
Yeah, right.
It even bypasses Grafton. So it was 3 hours away. So I think Rick was closer to Boona than I was to Grafton.
Yeah.
But from the minute I left home, I was like paying all my rent and all that kind of thing, and so the money was very handy. Who was the other person you heard who went?
It was you two. That's you
really?
Two. That's all I know of. And everyone else that you kind of hear about that went to Bond certainly weren't studying journalism either. So what was it like there? What was the feeling? Did it feel like you were in the spaceship at Bond? It's like it's not a sandstone university. It's more like a very modern kind of Gold Coast. It almost feels like a private school.
With hindsight, yes, but I didn't know that at the time. I really enjoyed it. I really liked my teachers, but it is the first time I encountered proper wealth, real wealth, not just kids of lawyers and doctors, although there are a lot of kids of lawyers and doctors. I became friends with people who were heirs to multi-million-dollar fortunes. Like it was almost another planet in some ways, their lives and how they lived compared. Especially, I think it's it's very obvious that it's one of the reasons Rick and I became so close. You know, obviously fellow travelers in attitudes and interests and all that, but also we were a very, very small minority of not well-off people at that university.
Local scrappers. That's
although he approached it differently. He was really funny. He writes in his book about how he went out to sushi and he'd never used chopsticks before. And went out to Japanese with Bond, and all the Bond kids, of course, knew how to use chopsticks. And he was so paralyzed that he just didn't eat. Whereas I had a similar experience, except I just asked the waiter for a fork and didn't care.
Yeah, it's either the fork or the stabbing technique.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I want to. I mean, you've done a lot of writing. You spent a bit of time at Brisbane Times. What was the setup there? Was that your average share house in and out of the Parliament kind of reporting?
Yeah, well, I was in Parliament for a little bit. I was working for Brisbane Times, so it was a news website. So I never worked for a newspaper again after I left the Bully. Mm-hmm. I've been in online news ever since. And I actually lived with my sister up there. Mm-hmm. My sister and I moved in together, sharing half a house. You know, there's Queenslanders split down the middle.
Oh, yeah.
And so the floorboards are still shared. So someone walking in their house in inverted commas next door, you can hear in your house, like they're walking in your house.
And everyone uses the same stairs into the house.
Yes.
There's just two doors at the front.
Yeah, exactly. And it'd been split very lazily that way. And then and then my sister moved to Sydney. She's my little sister. And I lived with another journo there for a while and her husband in the same house.
Yeah, right. And so what kind of lessons did you learn about the media? I mean, you said you went to university and everyone was talking about the death rattle of journalism, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in probably the most journalist job you could get, working in Parliament and living in a massive city. You
know, I've never ever felt like I was more at the centre of the world and the centre of everything happening than I felt at the Gold Coast Bulletin.
Yeah, right.
That newspaper was the place where I came in just towards the end of the massive Gold Coast property boom that drove, it was a massive newspaper. It was, the Gold Coast Bulletin was known as the cash cow of News Corp. There was plenty of money in the first couple of years I was there. Then it began to...
All the footy teams franchises were developing.
Yeah,
Gold
so
Coast
I was there when the
city.
Titans launched. Newspaper felt so vital and so important. And we felt like it really mattered what we were putting out each day and that everyone was reading it. And so that was actually the place that I felt most centre of the world. And I learned heaps about journalism there. I had to do, you're really thrown in the deep end. Then there I saw my first dead body. I saw a few dead bodies by the time I'd left. I went to fatal car accidents. I did death knocks. And I was only a teenager. I was 18, 19 myself. So, so I did all that kind of stuff and felt very much I was thrown in the deep end there. But it was very, very formative. And I feel like my formative years and what I learned a lot about journalism was learnt at the Gold Coast Bully. And there were a lot of senior people there who were so experienced and who taught me so much as well. And then when I got to the Brisbane Times, because it almost had like a startup feel because it was a news website.
Fairfax is going online.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't think I've ever worked with such a concentration of raw talent as what I did there. We were all like really, really young and had just pretty much been given our first or second jobs out of journalism. Connell Hanna was the editor and he's a super, super smart man who not in journalism anymore, which is a shame. So at both of those, actually, I felt centre of the world. And when I was going to Queensland Parliament, Anna Bligh was Premier. I covered her election loss. I was there when Campbell Newman came in. So that it felt like the eyes of Australia were on us then as well.
Did you just missed the floods?
Yeah, I was on the Gold Coast when the floods happened, and my sister was living in Brisbane. Yeah, so it didn't flood on the Gold Coast at all, but it was on our doorstep.
But you were there for the rebuild in Brisbane. Can you tell us, I mean, obviously we have a very different experience with only ever, as far as our newspapers kind of in a nationwide appeal, it's always been online. Tell us about when you felt those endorphins charging in your brain when you dropped something onto the internet that went viral. And what was it? The first time you realised, a lot of people are reading my shit right now.
I think the first thing I ever had that went viral was a story about a man being asked to move on a Virgin plane away from unaccompanying minors.
Oh, that'll get them going.
Yeah, and it causes like the big national debate and people read it out on the breakfast shows. So I felt a little bit removed from that as well. But I think the first time that I had something go properly viral and I did feel at the centre of it and felt like I was being watched and paid a lot of attention to was in 2013 when I was at a press conference. Tony Abbott was the opposition leader and he told me to calm down.
Oh, right.
Have you seen this?
No, I haven't.
It's still online and it was covered in newspapers. It was covered online. They went properly viral because it was seen as an example of his misogyny because I kept asking him questions and then he said, calm down. And yeah, ran on all the news stations. It was all over Twitter. Like it was like, and then I was even like in the print edition of the Daily Telly.
Yeah, right. How does your family feel about you becoming a public figure or at least someone who's part of, the media? And then, that sounds like a lot of people were running in to support you in that scenario, but you do kind of find yourself in the crosshairs as a journalist in this country right now, particularly working at The Guardian, like nowadays. How did you, or they always had faith that you can kind of brush it off?
Well, I didn't get heaps of support then. I did from work and stuff, but Andrew Bolt actually ran a column about me that said all these trolls on me, and my 19-year-old sister at the time got attacked because of it and got told by random people on Twitter that she should be raped with a whiskey bottle or be my sister. So that was also the time that I came under the most fire. But my family definitely doesn't think of me as a public figure.
Yeah.
And they're proud. Like my mum is always like so stoked when I'm on television. And I think they must be proud in some ways, but I also get made fun of a lot, particularly by my siblings that are nurses doing real work. My brother will be like, I'm off to my real job now. Have fun on the computer. See ya.
When did you realise you had a book in you?
When I was reading a writing book called Bird by Bird, and which is a very famous book at advice on how to write. I think that I thought since I was a teenager that I would write a book one day and I just didn't know what it would be about. And I was reading this book, Bird by Bird, and in it she had this line saying, you can write the first draft as if no one's going to read it because you do not have to show anyone this. And this big switch flicked in my head where I thought specifically, I can write something that my parents aren't necessarily going to read.
Yeah, right.
And it was hugely freeing for me to write the first draft. And I put the book down like halfway through the chapter, walked downstairs in the place that I was living at the time in Annandale and opened the computer and started writing. And that was my first novel.
Really?
Yeah, that's how it started. And once I started, I just kept going.
In that novel, are we talking about The Way Things Should Be?
Yes.
You gave a voice to, I guess, at that time, it was a bit of a media cliche, the millennial, and your new book actually is showing the end of that era. But the millennial was a kind of entitled avocado, yada yada, smash dab kind of, I guess, archetype that existed in the Australian media in the conversation. Still does to a degree. It's even more humiliating for young people now, I guess, that they're kind of getting a bit older and
exactly. They still think that we're young, and millennials are turning 40, and they still are going on with those tropes.
But you gave a voice to, I guess, that generation, or at least a certain demographic within that generation about the pressures. Sure, we're not getting conscripted for Vietnam. But we do have the same...
Neither did the boomers, really.
Yeah, no, that was the silent generation. But, there are the same pressures and the same life. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that book? I mean, I eventually want to get to your most recent book, but tell us a little bit about that and how that resonated, which it did.
Well, I thought it was received as a millennial book for sure, and I was 29 when it was published, and I wrote it mostly when I was about 27. And so certainly it was received as a millennial voice. But I really thought that I was just writing a family drama. Mm-hmm. And that's what I wanted to get into. And I think of that book really as a love letter to my siblings. I'm the oldest of 4. I have a brother and 2 sisters. And that was the same makeup as the characters in the book, even though the characters in the book like far more awful than my siblings. And I also really enjoyed, I didn't want to write likable characters. I never really enjoy likable characters. So I really enjoyed writing it as, you know, people who were difficult to like, but who had their own inner turmoils going on while also trying to relate to each other. So that's what I was thinking of when I was writing it. And it was also, it was meant to be a twist on the classic wedding book as well. But yeah, it was certainly received as a millennial voice book at the time, because I guess it was just when millennials were starting to publish books when that came out.
When I compare you to Rick Morton, another great author that we've had on this podcast before, and one of the Diamantina Shire's favourite sons. When I compare you to Rick, it's interesting. Obviously, similar age, similar story, similar education, scholarship to bond. But Rick kind of has this yarn where he's got this generations on the land. Probably can't even follow that family tree back. You, despite being a small town kid, have a multicultural Australian upbringing. Lebanese father, your mother's from the Free State of Derry.
Yes.
And now you're married to a Ingham Italian. What do you kind of find between these tropes and the rural divide and the city? Because you've lived what many would say is a life that, oh no, you only get that in the suburbs. You only get that kind of, the multiculturalism, the migrant communities.
Yeah. It's funny you say that and bring that up, because I found when I moved to Sydney, I was really surprised at how segregated I found it, and how white I found certainly the parts that I was
told
hanging
to visit
around. Oh, told to and the industry I was hanging around, or in, obviously, as well. And I'd always thought of Sydney as a lot more diverse than that, and it absolutely is. But yeah, it felt quite segregated. There are definitely pockets that are really wide, and that wasn't like the way that I grew up. I did not feel like, it's certainly a lot of white people where I grew up, but it also felt a lot more mixed as well, and like we weren't all separated.
Not
from each other.
enclavey. It's not enclavey.
No, it wasn't enclavey at all. Growing up in Grafton.
It's interesting. Someone like you, Bridie, or someone like Rick, or plenty of other kind of writers or journalists in Australia that kind of come from your average town. I know Rick doesn't. Rick comes from the outback originally, but you come from the average town, and in this current media climate, your upbringing in Grafton is viewed as some sort of unique experience that we need to bridge the gap between detachment. Because, we do have obviously a media class and a political class where, we've got people like Angus Taylor moving to Goulburn 6 months before he gets elected there, inner city boy through and through. And there is an issue with how people communicate, be that media or politicians, with the bush or with regional towns. I imagine that's never been something you've considered, and how do you deal with that kind of those reality checks that for whatever reason you provide?
What's funny to me in Sydney, particularly because the Gold Coast and Brisbane, when I worked in media there, were always very well aware of the world outside of them and the country outside of them. But when I moved to Sydney, it's so funny to me that when they talk about getting out of the inner city mindset and the Sydney mindset, so often they bring up Western Sydney and they say we need more Western Sydney perspective, or Western Sydney is the forgotten people, certainly undercovered, certainly worthy of more stories and having their stories told. But, mate, Australia doesn't end at Western Sydney. Like, whenever people say that kind of thing, I think, and there's also communities further than Western Sydney as well. Like, I think, and I don't think that that's a perspective that comes from Western Sydney. It's the perspective that comes from inner city media when they're thinking that they should diversify, or when they're being accused of being too insular.
Yeah.
It's Western Sydney that they look to, and I just think, God, that you could be looking so much more further than that.
Over the hill, Lithgow even. Yeah, just west of Sydney, every single town's major employer is a prison. The thing that Rick said when he was, I guess, deep within the News Corp machine was that he realised the detachment when we were talking about the GP co-payment during that psycho 2014 budget, the Razor budget with Hockey and Abbott. And he said he was trying to explain to his editors that $7 co-payment was going to mean a lot of people didn't see the doctor, and that they had no fat to cut from their budget. People that don't smoke, don't drink, don't gamble, that was going to cost them. And they refused to believe him. They thought he was making it up. Have you had a few moments where you're like, well, actually, some of these people around me aren't in the real world?
Occasionally, mainly when talking about schooling, but it's interesting that's Rick's specific experience and the thing that he remembers, because I was in the budget lockup with The Guardian that night when GP co-payment was one of the things that I think it had been leaked beforehand, but it was confirmed that night. But I was in there with a very small Guardian team as we realised the extent of the cuts in that budget and how brutal it was. It was also planning to cut people off the dole after 6 months, doing just these horrendous things. And
Lifters, not leaners.
Yeah, lifters, not leaners. And it took a little while for the media in general to cotton on to how harsh that budget was. There was certainly, it was covered broadly as a harsh budget, but sort of along that lifter-leaner line. And then after a couple of weeks, people began to realise how harsh, except for Lenore Taylor, who was the political editor of The Guardian at the time. She's now my boss. And I'm not just sucking up to her because she won't listen to this, but she was pretty much the first press gallery journalist to write out straight from the bat that night, this budget is terrible. Like, this is a terrible, cruel budget. And she was one of the first gallery journalists to call that out. So certainly at The Guardian, I haven't really had to play that role at all, because The Guardian is something that understands or tries very hard to understand disadvantage in different sectors of our society. And and that's why I've probably had a lot better time at work in the past few years than Rick did when he was working at the Oz. We couldn't have been in more different workplaces at those points.
I guess working in The Guardian, you would have as you just pointed out, you'd have a whiteboard with a lot of things up top that would be at the bottom at other newspapers, namely housing, climate change,
Immigration.
Immigration. A lot of those
Indigenous affairs too.
Indigenous affairs, and a lot of issues that some can write off as you just lefty, in a city lefty whinge, but at the same time are urgent. Do you think your time working at The Guardian as the bearer of bad news for a lot of people, the bearer of bad news that just wouldn't get covered anywhere else, has informed your new book, which is about the millennial I'm going to say this, existential crisis?
You said that perfectly. I'd never thought of that, but you make a really good point. And I think certainly being tits deep in the worst news there is to deliver each day, and some very dreadful news, particularly when it comes to climate change. And also for me, like poverty is another thing that we cover a lot, and I am very moved by. That certainly probably contributed, although I hadn't put those two things together until now, that having to be in that daily news cycle probably does make me a bit more cynical than most people. But I guess I've lived in the daily news cycle my entire adult life, actually, so I guess I don't know any different either.
Yeah. Can we go into that book now? You've just published it. It's called Trivial Grievances. This is a kind of look at, as we said, the end of adolescence for millennials, and all the things that, all of the hurdles that millennials are now facing that they've seen their parents face under very different circumstances.
Yes. Yeah, so it's basically, it's a book about going through an existential crisis, essentially, but the existential crisis for many millennials in their early 30s is happening in really different circumstances to generations before us. Doesn't necessarily make it more difficult or harder, and I don't say that millennials have it hard, although, oh my God, every single ABC radio host I've talked to has definitely tried to get me to say that. But but it ended up, at the beginning, I thought it was going to be a book about, general misery that people in their early 30s seem to be hitting about their life not turning out the way that they thought. The markers of adulthood, stable job, housing, marriage, children, more out of reach for a lot of people than for more people than have previously felt. And I think certainly most of us looking to our parents, although not in my case, but I know broadly, people's parents usually owned houses by this age. They were usually married and they had their families and they were in very stable long-term jobs. And that just, all of those things, apart from maybe marriage, quite difficult for our generation. So I thought the book was going to be about that. It turned out into a much broader book about having an existential crisis, the big questions of life, and how to get out of it, how to get out of that malaise and misery, but also making the point that it's not such a bad thing to hit that phase of your life either, and you probably will hit it more than once too.
Yep. And it's a bit more than a quarter life crisis as well.
Yeah, we're a bit old. We're a bit too old for the quarter life crisis.
The quarter life crisis is just a shaved head, isn't it?
Exactly. We're a bit old for the quarter life crisis, but it's still hitting. It was actually, that was weird. When I first noticed that with myself and with a few mates, I only wrote it as like a summer light life piece. You know, it's summer between Christmas and New Year's. There's no real news. So you write these like pieces about life. They can run at any time, aren't tied to the news cycle. I just wrote it as one of those, and that generally we have fewer readers around that time of year. And
so this was for the newspaper, for the Guardian.
Yeah. We started out as an opinion piece about that people in their 30s are really miserable at the moment. Millennials in their 30s are really miserable, and I wrote it, and it launched on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. Didn't think about it really. Went to bed, woke up the next day, more than 600,000. Reads around the world.
Wow.
It was nuts.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's when I knew I was onto something.
That was the warm hug I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately first came to you in the shape of just unbridled misogyny from a politician and an Andrew Bolt column. But, okay, so you realised you'd struck a chord there, struck a vein, and then started mapping this thing out. Tell us the perspective that you're writing from. It's not like your last book where you're kind of telling the story of someone. You're telling the story of you.
Yeah, well, that was the scary thing about nonfiction. There's a bit of memoir in this. Mm-hmm. I've also interviewed people, and there's a bit of philosophy. Like, it's a funny kind of book, but it was definitely weirder to be writing about myself in this book. But I sold it to a publisher off basically like 2 pages of a sketchy outline, and the book ended up being a very different thing. But I got that book deal February 2020. The bushfires had just hit, and I got the deal, and I thought, great, things are calming down. The news cycle's calming down. I'll just spend the next quiet few months working on this book.
Little did you know, 2 kids at home, locked down, trying to write this little book.
Well, actually, I had my second baby in the middle of all that.
Okay.
So I was pregnant during the pandemic, giving birth, writing the book. And there's this bit in the book that's about how you don't have to achieve anything, and we don't have to turn our hobbies into side hustles, and it's fine to just pass the time in a pleasant way and not be productive. And yet I knew the delicious irony and obnoxiousness of me saying that while also writing a book with a baby during a pandemic.
And then you kind of you get to a place, I guess, at the end of the book where there's light coming through, and just just a way of reframing the way you think about things in this day and age. And then I've read and heard you talk about this. That's all done and dusted. You've handed that book through, and then you have a life and death scenario, like not life and death accident up there in the beautiful north of Queensland. The book was done by that stage, and you had a car accident.
Yeah, it was handed in, and I'd even done my final edits. Like, everything was ticked off. I think the book had maybe was on its way to the printers when that happened.
Right. And it's almost like would have been a great little like last chapter as well.
It would have been. So I'll have to explain, obviously, for the listeners who didn't read about it. I was, in North Queensland in April, and I was in the back of a car my husband was driving. I was sitting between my toddler and my baby. We're on the Bruce Highway, north of Townsville, and we got hit from behind by a semi-trailer, and the car rolled 3 times. It was insane. And
slow motion?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think maybe the only thing in my life that has ever happened in slow motion, it happened in complete slow motion. I put an arm in front of each of my kids and braced, like that was going to do shit, but whatever, and braced, and I realized, the first thing I remember is the windscreen just smashing and me looking at it and being like, oh no. And that's when it clicked with me, we're in a car accident. And then we were upside down. I thought it's rolling, and I thought, don't roll again, don't roll again, don't roll again. Then it rolled again. And I thought, don't roll again. Like, it was this real slow motion, don't roll again. And then we rolled again. But that was all in a matter of seconds, but for me felt a lot longer. And then we ended up rolling 3 times and finished right side up.
Upright, yeah, right.
Upright by the side of the highway. And this woman came running over and opened the door, the side my baby was on, and said, I just screamed at her, ring an ambulance, ring an ambulance. And she said, I'm an off-duty paramedic. And I just said, get my kids out. And we were all conscious.
Yeah.
And fine. We were all fine. I couldn't believe it though. Like
what kind of rig were you driving in? You get hit by a semi-trailer and...
Holden, Colorado.
Right on.
With an anti-roll bar on the back. And it was my father-in-law's, because they live in outside of Townsville. We were picked up by my mother-in-law. And as we got into the car, I said, why does Alan have this ridiculous car? It's so big. He doesn't need, because he's a publican. He's not a farmer. I said, why does he got such a big car? He doesn't need this car. As we got in. And yeah, he needed that car. It saved all of our lives.
Oh, wow.
And we got visited in the hospital because we all still had to go to hospital. They actually dispatched the helicopter because the 000 call was car hit by truck in 100 zone has rolled 3 times. And usually that is that's grim scene.
Yeah.
And so they called off, the road ambos got to us, they called off the chopper when they realised we were all conscious and breathing. We still got taken to hospital, and we were visited by multiple doctors and nurses because it got around the hospital.
Yeah, right.
There was this family in this accident and they're all fine. And people came to talk to us and ask us, like, how are you? And they just, all of them just kept saying, we never see this, we never see this, we never see this. We never see everyone fine.
Wowee. How did the kids take that? I mean, the baby obviously's, that's going to be a story the baby will hear about. But your 3-year-old, conscious the whole time.
He ended up having the best week of his life because his brother ended up in hospital, was fine, but ended up in hospital for 5 days, just for a few different reasons that weren't to do with the accident. And so we were staying in a hotel in Townsville. My brother, when he got the call about the accident, booked his tickets to Townsville the next day. So his uncle was there. His little brother wasn't around to annoy him. He was staying in this hotel in Townsville. He just had the best week of his life. And then when I talked to him about it, because I was still talking to, he's 3. He's old enough kind of to realise what's going on. So I had a few conversations with him and he'd bring it up because my shoulder was broken. So
was that the only real...
That was the only real injury. I had a broken shoulder, that's it.
Out of everyone in the car?
Everyone, yep. How crazy is that? And so it got strapped at different times and he didn't like it when my shoulder was strapped and he would ask me to take it off and I'd say, no, my shoulder's sore. And that's when we had the conversation. He said, why? And I said, because of the car crash. And he said, the ute. I said, yeah. He goes, the ute broke. I said, yeah, the ute did break. I said, then what happened? And he said, Daddy got an owie because my husband had just blood on his knuckles from the windscreen, but because it's blood, like toddlers are obsessed with that. And I said, yeah, your dad got an owie. And then I said, and then what happened? And he's like, and then I rode in an ambulance.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So the whole thing's just an adventure. Kids don't have a comprehension. This is what I realized. Kids don't have a comprehension of what could have happened. Mm-hmm. What happened is what happened. That's just what happened. There's no... Ideas don't enter their mind of what could have happened. And that is a traumatic thing for me, my husband, what could have happened and what we kept being told could have happened. So that's why I think the toddler's fine with it.
It is a shame we didn't get to put that in the back of Trivial Grievances, but you have said you've kind of left that accident with a euphoric zest for life was the words. Well,
it was true euphoria.
Yeah.
That wore off, but I was in a euphoric state for 2 weeks.
Really?
Yeah, there's a science to it. It's something to do with the adrenaline, but I was dead set in euphoria for 2 weeks. My shoulder was broken and I was stuck in North Queensland, not, with a few different things, but nothing could bother me. Nothing could touch me during that time. It was the most amazing feeling. It was like being blissed out.
Yeah.
But it also obviously puts everything, it sharpens up your focus in life and certainly sharpens up life a bit and what's important. And I think that those kind of things stay with you, even though the euphoria wears off and I'm back to getting annoyed by dumb things like a coffee order taking too long. But there's still, a part of me that is definitely appreciating things a bit more and holding on to stuff a bit more than I did before the accident.
Yeah. And what sounds like a hell of a prank for everyone to walk out of.
Yeah. Oh, it's basically a miracle.
Yeah. Well, that's the unofficial last chapter or forward of Bridie Jabour, professionally, Bridie Jabour in Grafton. Trivial Grievances out now. It's been a great chat, Bridie. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much.